Hey, folks, thanks for downloading, subscribing, and listen. This is the LLA Show. Live life aggressively. Sincere Hogan, that's me, Mike Marlowe on the other line. What's going on, dude?
Oh, I'm doing good, man. I'm excited about our guest today. It's a good friend of mine, and we'll get to him in a second. But I just wanted to give a quick thank you to Charles Poliquin. He was on our show last episode. And not only is Charles always a great guest, wealth of information, gives us plenty of time, he's one of the few guests that goes out of his way to really promote the episode. I mean, he lit it up on Facebook, Twitter, etc., which we can see by the numbers. I mean, I woke up this morning, I was like, whoa. I was like, someone actually responded to that email I sent about promoting the episode and took heed to it. I can't tell you how many guests we've had who don't do anything to promote the episode.
And they're listening right now. Yeah, you. Yeah, and guess what? Here's the thing. Now that you're feeling all crappy about it, here's something you can do. Why don't you go ahead and promote it right now? Make up for lost time. You know who you are. Yeah, you, buddy. And Budette.
Sometimes if I don't ask them, then it's on me, right? Because sometimes people get busy, you just don't think about it. But when I consciously make the decision to say, hey, man, here are the show notes that Sincere put together. Please post this on your platforms. And then they don't do it. What's that?
Right.
That's them basically saying, nah, I want to leverage your audience, but I don't want you to leverage my audience.
Exactly.
That's basically what that means.
Oh, man. You got to love this industry.
Yeah, it's mainly fitness professionals who fall into this category.
Exactly.
Right. So we have a great guest today who is not only going to help you make more money, but hold on to it. And the reason why we're bringing him on the show is self-serving. We want you to make more money so you have less excuses to support us. So we expect to see the Patreon numbers go way up after this episode. And I expect to see a huge spike in sales.
Hey, man, I need to sell out of the remaining Sharia doors that I have here before I move on to those exclusive ones that I'm having for 2016. So let's go ahead and clear this out right now. And one good thing about having our guest on today also, Mike, because 'tis the season to be a broke ass. You know, we're heading into the holiday season right now, and most people are driven by freaking guilt. And guilt is the wrong thing to have when it comes to spending money, because a lot of times you're spending money on crap that nobody gives a damn about, but you feel bad if you don't get them something.
And people you don't give a damn about.
Exactly.
It's like the whole obligatory. It's like, yeah, I got to buy some gifts for my coworkers. Oh, you mean the ones you don't like?
Exactly. like seriously.
The ones who are always talking smack behind their back at the water cooler, those guys? Yeah.
Exactly.
Go ahead and buy those gifts.
Exactly. So yeah, man. So this is our gift to you in the holiday season right now, because you don't have to buy that crap anymore. You can do better things with your money, and that's what our guest is going to help you figure out right now.
Yeah, our guest is Rohit Kalra, and he's a financial expert. I've actually known Rohit for almost 20 years now. I've known him for a long time.
Yeah. Wow.
And he's a really sharp guy. He's a guy that even when he was 17, 18, he had money invested in mutual funds. He's reading books on how to acquire wealth, how to get wealthy as a teenager. So this is a guy who was way ahead of his time. Rohit, how you doing, buddy?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on the show.
Yeah, man, it's great to have you on here. And not only are you an accountant, but you help people with their financial profiles and helping them hold on to money, grow their wealth.
Correct. Absolutely. I have a CPA firm here in Fairfax and a wealth management firm as well. Today, my objective is to try to steer clear of sort of obscure topics that folks can't necessarily relate to. So I'm not going to talk about, estate planning or insurance or anything like that, but instead I'm going to focus on universal financial strategies that hopefully everybody that listens to this can get something really valuable from.
Oh, that sounds great.
Awesome.
So let me start from the beginning here. I used to skip this step when talking to folks, and I realized that we really need to start really all the way at the beginning because I've seen this in practice so many times. And a lot of what I'm going to share today are actual insights from working with real clients over the last 15 years. And so these are case studies from working with literally hundreds of clients over a long period of time and things that everybody can learn from. So where I'd like to start is with a concept called net cash flow. And I illustrate this example by sort of showing something that I've seen in practice, which is what do these two individuals have in common? So I'll give you an example. An individual that makes about $30,000 a year, who spends about $30,000 a year, in comparison to an individual that makes about $3 million a year, who also similarly has lifestyle expenses and expends $3 million a year.
Right.
seems sort of self-evident, but I see this over and over again in practice. And the answer is that those two people have an impaired ability to make financial progress.
Right.
And again, it seems so straightforward, but the concept of net cash flow precedes everything that we're going to talk about today, because when we get into investing later on, it's all predicated on whether or not an individual actually has something left over at the end of the month to actually funnel towards some sort of investment. So what is net cash flow? Net cash flow is simply all your inflows less all your outflows. So basically your inflows would be a combination of your income and assets that you own. That would increase your inflows because those assets would also throw off some income potentially. And that would be all your inflows in your household minus your expenses and liabilities. That would decrease those inflows. So those would be your outflows. So when looking at net cash flow, the first thing that folks want to do is optimize their net cash flow. And so there's only two ways really to do that, or three ways actually. Either you increase your income and your assets, or you decrease your expenses and liabilities, or you do both. And again, I can't stress how often I see this, because it doesn't matter how much money you make. You know, if you're making $400,000 or $500,000 a year, or $40,000 or $50,000 a year, I see this regularly. The key takeaway here is that you've got to focus on what's left over if you want to make financial progress. At some point, your expenses need to be less than your income.
Yeah, to a large extent, it's more what you keep than what you're making.
Right.
Right?
Exactly.
So, I mean, you could, like Jim Rohn says, you make $10,000 a month, but you're spending $11,000. Now you're in a deficit that's accumulating each month.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And you know, one of the things I like to share on this topic, and it's not, you know, sexy, it's not anything that's some sort of cool ninja trick. I'm not in the business of selling books, so I don't have any, you know, clever tricks to share with people. And you know, basically it all boils down to, if you fix if your income is fixed, as an example, the easiest way to increase your net cash flow is to decrease your expenses. And what does that mean? What does that involve in real life in practical terms? Really what it means is you've got to curb some of those material desires. Even if it's temporary, you've got to deal with that issue. And so basically, you know, what that translates to effectively is delayed gratification. You can't have everything you want right away. And you know, an analogy would be, you know, using a fitness analogy, at some point, if you want to create a calorie deficit, you simply just got to push away from the table. I mean, it's just as simple as that. Yeah. And this is no different. And so when I see this in practice, you know, we talk about this issue, and folks should listen to and reflect on this issue. The question to ask yourself is, what can I do to increase my income? If I've optimized that, what can I do to decrease my expenses? And then move forward from there so you can optimize your net cash flow. You've got to have as much left over at the end of each month. And once you've done that, now we can sort of move on to everything else we're going to talk about, which is, you know, investing in financial strategies. And
it seems that a lot of people always focus on making more but not keeping more, right? So they'll listen to what you have to say and go, okay, I need to make more money. But then what happens is you end up spending more money. It's kind of like people using a fitness analogy again, is people push away from the table, but because they're eating less, they have less energy, and now their activity level drops. You know, so the whole thing balances out.
But
so I think that's where there's often a disconnect.
Here's the question, though, Rohit. Like, how do you, when you're dealing with clients, when you're telling them this, because trust me, right now, I know so many people are listening, they're like, okay, that's just common sense. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, but it still doesn't register. Just like eating a bunch of crappy food, we realize that, okay, it's going to make you very unhealthy, blah, blah. People are like, yeah, that makes sense, but they still do it. So my thing is, how do you, when you're talking to your clients, how do you get into that psychology and really instill this into their mind and really help them change their mindset about how they view money? Because a lot of times, no matter what kind of good intentions we may have as far as increasing our income and living a better lifestyle and just getting the hell out of the poorhouse, and we're not trying to get in there, we have these issues that a lot of times are not even tapped into, that we have deeply ingrained in our brains about how we view money. Just like how people are with food a lot of times. You know, a lot of times, no matter how hard they try, how many diets they do, how many times they work out, something happened psychologically to them, whether they had the parent that force fed them like, hey, you better clean that plate, I'm gonna whoop your ass. They're starving children in Africa, they could be eating that food, or there was a kid that pushed the little girl down in second grade in the sandbox and called her a fat ass, back then, and here she is 30 years later, she still has problems with food. How do you help people with that mindset with money as well? Because the same things happen, in our households with our parents, how we view money as well.
Well, I'll tell you one thing that works well for me in terms of working with my client base. Because our client base is mostly business owners, I've spent 15 years working almost exclusively with business owners. I tend to give them an analogy that relates to business, and so some folks might be able to relate to this, and some folks might not. But basically what I tell them is, I said, when it comes to managing your net cash flow in your life, in your household, you should treat your household like you do a business. And so the analogy, they can relate to it as business owners, because astute business owners, what they typically will do is they tend to be liberal or aggressive with those investments that will make them money, but they tend to be very aggressive at the same time in terms of keeping their expenses as low as possible. And they will only allow into their businesses those expenses that have some justification or rationale for somehow making them money, or it has to be necessary, and they will ruthlessly cut everything else. And I think that word ruthlessly cut is important, because you've got to get intense about this if you want to make financial progress. There has to be some level of intensity with respect to, the approach that you take if you really want to manage your expenses aggressively. And I don't tell people to get rid of all expenses such that it robs you of current enjoyment in life. No. But there are expenses which are, necessary. There's expenses that are unnecessary. There's expenses that rob you of they don't make you money, and there's expenses out there that you can introduce into your business that do make you money. They're I'm
curious, Rohit, what are some of the unnecessary expenses that you find are very common?
Well, in personal or in business?
Let's start off with personal and then business as well.
One of the things that I see, and it's as difficult for many people to deal with, because it's an emotional sort of response, and it's an emotional decision. But housing is a big one.
Yeah.
Yes.
And housing is a big one. So basically, when it comes to housing, people generally get emotional about the type or of house that they want and the amount that they're willing to spend on housing.
I think they also feel that they need to be a homeowner to be successful in America. Like, that's the American dream. If I don't own a house, then I'm not as good as my neighbors who do.
Exactly. I'm not American enough.
Yeah, I'm going to actually be talking about that, dispelling that myth here in a little bit when we get to that.
Sure.
But when we talk about housing, and it boils down. A lot of it boils down to social comparison. Right?
Yeah, no doubt.
Especially in today's sort of environment where everybody's on Facebook and dealing social media, if you will, and they're effectively, what they're doing is they're subconsciously comparing themselves to others, and because that messaging is so much more powerful now than it used to be, where unless you actually met somebody and compared notes, you didn't really have a reason to compare yourself to others. It wasn't always top of mind. Now it's always top of mind. Somebody goes out and buys a new car, it's on Facebook. Somebody's out and buying a big house, it's on Facebook. And other people are seeing what their friends and family are doing, and they feel like they have to, keep up with that, if you will.
Right.
And that just leads to, falling behind financially, because you can't compete with someone who's willing to finance and take out a loan or take out a lease, that no matter how unfavorable the terms may be, you don't know what the terms are behind the scenes in terms of what they're doing to acquire those things.
Right.
And so it doesn't make sense to keep up with that.
Yeah.
So
for all we know, they could have a money laundering business on the side.
Well, like I say, like Instagram, for instance, you always see all these girls on these vacations in Dubai, but then you never see the sugar daddies that's financing those trips to Dubai. So don't get all excited about that. Like, oh man, I need to go to Dubai now. Well, are you willing to do what she did to go to Dubai? So yeah, think about that.
Absolutely. Well, let me change gears and talk about sort of the next step, which is, now that you have first optimized your net cash flow and really put some thought into it, okay, and so that you're not wasting money every month on things that you don't want or need. Now you've got some money to invest in. You've got something that you can use to funnel towards investment. So now then the question becomes, well, what should I be investing in? What can I do with these seeds that I want to plant so that they will bear the most fruit down the road? And so before I answer that question in the context of investing, because I hear most financial planners and other financial advisors, they go straight into the stock market, the bond market. I'm not going to do that right away. I'm not going to do that because I want to sort of frame this and share a framework with folks that I think will really serve them throughout their lifetimes. Now, it's a general rule of thumb. There's always exceptions, so I want to throw out that caveat. But if they adhere to it, you really can't go too far wrong. And so let me share this framework with you. It's a little complicated, but I'm going to define it and break it down so it makes a lot of sense. So the framework that I've come up with over the years is where should you attempt your investment discretion? So now that you've got something to invest, where should you attempt to use your discretion in terms of where to put that money? So to their detriment, what I find is people often spend their time and effort, attempting investment discretion on the wrong things. And we're going to talk about that more, things like stock picking and market timing and other things that don't really serve them well in the long run because they could instead be focusing their attention on other things that will serve them better. So here's my framework. You should attempt to exercise investment discretion based on the degree of liquidity of that item that you're looking at, that alternative that you're looking at, and the amount of control that you can exert over it. So let me define that. Degree of liquidity in this example would be the efficiency of the market or the ease at which you can buy or sell something. And the amount of control is just that, to the extent that you can apply your intellect or your own resourcefulness to that endeavor. So let me give you some concrete examples about what I mean with this, and then I think it's going to make a lot of sense. So the first thing is, what I tell people is you should focus on investing in yourself. And that might be surprising to hear some sort of financial advisor talk about that and not talk about the capital markets. But when you think about that as a primary investment, before anything else, before looking at anything else, and we're going to talk about business, we're going to talk about real estate, we're going to talk about capital markets. Before I get what people need to realize is that when we talk about investing in yourself, well, let's look at my framework. Liquidity is a non-issue, and the amount of control that you can exert, well, you can exert the maximum amount of control over yourself. And so this is talking about really taking any excess cash you have and investing it in things like courses that might move you forward. It doesn't have to be traditional education. It could be self-education, but unique opportunities that can basically help you improve on yourself. It might be something where you can improve your technical skills. It might be something that improve your marketing ability, your marketing skills, your sales skills, any sort of skill that you can invest in yourself, because what you'll find when you look back over a long time horizon is that the returns that you can generate from investing in yourself tend to be higher than almost anything else. And so
I definitely agree with that. Just to cut in for a second, because I got into one kettlebell course, launched a six-figure income for me for many years as a kettlebell instructor, right? It all started with that one course I took in 2002, the RKC certification. I mean, that's not the reason I made all that money, but that was the starting point that allowed me to go down that path. And then I took the money I made from that and invested it back into myself, learning other skills such as hormone optimization, which led to me doing a lecture series that was very lucrative. And then I studied nutrition supplements and how to design them and got into that business. And every time I research something which leads to me launching a new product, that ends up creating a revenue source that is way more than what I would make in the market. So I agree 100% with what you're saying, is that you can never invest too much in yourself. I think the key is you don't want to be someone who's addicted to taking courses and never does anything with the information. Yeah, that's a lot of people. They just go to Tony Robbins seminars. They may even come to courses such as what Sincere and I teach, but they don't do anything with it.
Yeah, implementation is the key. You've got to take action. But you should. What I see, and the reason I mentioned this item before I talk about anything else, is what I see is that folks sometimes stop investing in themselves. In other words, once they graduate from from college or whatever professional
Absolutely.
program they went to,
Yeah.
they think that's the end. And
Right.
that's you couldn't be further from the truth there. That's
Well,
just
I
the
think a
beginning.
lot of people have a negative association with education, right? Because they go to college and they push through, and then they're like, oh, thank God I graduated. I'm never reading a book again. It's like that kind of mentality, right? Or they do their PhD and they're like, forget it. I don't want to learn anything ever again.
It's like,
Right? My
yeah.
brother always has a theory about that, right? Because both of my parents are PhDs, and my dad can't turn the DVD player on to save his life, right? Roger's always like, these guys just don't want to learn anything new because they burned out that learning process so severely by doing their PhDs that once they finish that, they're like, finally, it's over.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And to sort of dovetail to the next idea, just kind of piggybacking off of that, the next item that I tell folks in this sort of this tier, if you will, is once you've maximized that and you've got a trajectory that you're constantly improving yourself, introducing new skills and new ideas, because one good idea could change the trajectory of everything, whether it's in your business or your career. The next area to focus on is just that, business and your career. And so before we talk about real estate or capital markets, we can't skip talking about investing in your business. And there's a good example I like to share on this topic, because we work with a lot of small business owners and dentists and physicians and other professionals. And basically, I pick on dentists for a minute because I give an example and I say, you know what? Let me give you an example of two dentists, and they both graduate on the same day from the same school, and they had the exact same training, and they're the exact same age. And then you fast forward 10 or 15 years later and take inventory of where they are and what they're doing and how much money they're making. And if they both started in the same place, why is it that one is, doing very, very well, maybe somewhere in the $600,000, $800,000, $900,000 a year range, and the other one is still struggling financially? Why is that? How could that be? If they have the same license from the same school and they started on the same day, what led to this disparity? And this disparity is an example. I'm not picking on dentists. I'm just using them as an example. You can substitute in anybody here because it's true for any field, if you will.
I think one dentist probably did a bunch of unnecessary operations, and maybe the other one didn't.
What I see when I look at this, and I've seen these case studies in practice, is when the dentist is doing really, really well, once they maximize sort of this invest in yourself concept, they were very liberal and aggressive in investing in their business from a standpoint of investing in training and implementation of, for example, marketing, in their case presentation, in their financial management, in their management of people, and some of these other factors that you don't necessarily learn explicitly in dental school, but they're willing to make investments in their own business. And so this is something that if you go back to my framework where I talked about where should you attempt investment discretion based on the degree of liquidity and the amount of control you can exert. Well, when you look at businesses in general, there is a issue with liquidity, because if you want to buy or sell a business, if you want to sell a business, for example, it's challenging. You can't just go online and press a button and say, hey, sell, I'm going to buy this stock. You've got to find a business broker perhaps, or you have to find a buyer yourself. It's a process. And so liquidity is an issue. And the amount of control you can exert, well, presumably if you're the sole owner, you can exert a lot of control, or even, let's say, a 50% owner, you can exert a lot of control. So you should funnel that time and energy to optimize your business. And it just makes sense, doesn't it? I mean, it's sort of like, it almost seems like it's common sense, but I see this in practice all the time where people don't necessarily have a framework like this. They don't know what to do with that extra cash that's sitting around, and they're just stockpiling it. It might be parked in a money market.
Well, what would be an example of a good investment in your business, right? Because I think a lot of people think, okay, I'm going to blow a lot of money on advertising and marketing.
Right.
And I've always found that to be a negative. Anytime I've blown a lot of money in advertising, it's never worked out well. But when I've done stuff such as Sincere and I launching the show, for example, that was an investment in both of our respective businesses. And that's been very successful. Anytime I invest in developing more content on my website or making my website more seamless, easier to use, so it's easier to purchase something.
Yeah, I would actually categorize those under the umbrella of advertising and marketing. Whether it's content creation or whether it's launching a podcast.
Good point.
Working on that, I would actually put that under the umbrella of advertising and marketing. You can definitely waste a lot of money on the wrong advertising and marketing, but you can do some things on the right avenues that might not cost a lot of money, but use your resourcefulness and your time and energy and focus on the things that work. Until you test a lot of those things out, you really don't know what is going to be a winner versus what might not be a winner. You've got to test it. But advertising and marketing, since you brought it up, I think is actually an important sort of awareness to have. And I can tell you this from having looked at P&Ls and balance sheets of literally hundreds of businesses over the last 15 years. What I often see, and this is definitely an important insight. There's no question about this insight. When we look at financials and really analyze them and interpret them, what we often see among those businesses that really rise to the top and are leaders in their market, in their geographic area, over time, as their wherewithal to spend increases, as they become more successful, those that are really doing the testing and figuring out, okay, where can I spend within the advertising and marketing sort of bucket, if you will, and then they make those investments because they're consistently increasing their customer acquisition costs over time, those are the businesses that rise and do really, really well. And to be more specific, to provide a counterexample, when we see those businesses that are struggling, we look at, what type of marketing spend are they spending relative to their revenue in terms of percentage of revenue. When I see a business that, is struggling financially and they're basically spending maybe 1 or 2% a year on advertising and relative to their revenue, and still they're struggling, that does provide some clues, because when we look at those businesses that are spending 10 or 20%, there's no rule of thumb here, but they're just spending a higher amount than their peers and their competitors. What happens is they simply acquire more customers, and they have sort of this ripple effect that happens. I mean, I can talk more about that ripple effect, but marketing spend and advertising spend, it does pay dividends if done properly. I mean, I would say your podcast is probably a good example of successful advertising and marketing. I would, if it's fair to put that under that umbrella. And what you find is, for those businesses that sort of excel in that area, marketing affects, price, for example. So those businesses that are more effective marketers, they tend to be able to charge more than those businesses that are not as aggressive with their marketing. They tend to be able to select their customers, clients, or patients more so than those businesses that can't be as discerning because they simply don't have as many leads, or their phone doesn't ring as often. Interestingly, we also see that the quality of their services tend to be better because they're bringing in better clients at higher prices, so they have more money available internally to provide a better quality product or better quality service. And another ripple effect from that is that they tend to hire better employees, which also impacts qualities because they have more available. They've got more. They've got, instead of having to find somebody at X amount of the year, they can find somebody at X plus $30,000 a year. Find the best people, recruit the best people. That's one example. It's a case by case study. Another example might be having the ability to buy better equipment, right? To provide whatever you're doing. I mean, I could go through a bunch of examples in that area, but the key
some doctors are like Dr. Eric Braverman uses something called a DEXA scan now, which is basically 21st century technology where you can scan every organ in the body. Now, most doctors, they're sticking their finger in your prostate, right? So, that which is a very antiquated way of assessing organ health. Now, that's basically a prehistoric compared to what's available. So, as a result, a smart doctor is leaning towards this technology that I just mentioned, not only because obviously it's It's going to make the customer much more compliant. You're going to be less reticent about going or less reluctant rather about going to the doctor for the visit. And then 2, it's more accurate. So you just increased your value several fold with one purchase.
Absolutely. That's a great example. I mean, I think the takeaway from this item here is simply to ask the question, and it doesn't matter, even if you don't have a business, anybody can do this. The question to ask is, what can I do to improve the value of my business or grow my career? In other words, consciously think about it, take steps in that direction. Don't overlook it as an investment opportunity. And I'm trying to frame it as an investment opportunity, because to the extent that you can do things to hire better people or acquire more clients, customers, or patients, or improve the equipment that you have in your business, to create efficiencies, to grow your career, you should be asking these questions before we get to other things like real estate or the capital markets.
Well, I think a good point you brought up also is to attract high-quality customers. A lot of people make the mistake of just wanting anybody that's willing to be a customer.
Yeah, huge mistake.
A lot of fitness professionals are going, I just want volume. It's like, no, you don't want volume. You don't want people that are a total nuisance to deal with, that are a headache, that are going to cost you a lot of time, because time is money as well. Time's a resource, and you don't get time back. Once you waste a lot of time, it's gone. It's not a renewable energy source. So
you don't want to be those.
With my business, I called, like, a guy on a podcast yesterday was going, what do you do with people that need motivation and they need help at this? I go, I don't work with such people.
Exactly.
People who come to me are they just need to know what to do. They're already motivated. They're going, I'm sick of being in whatever state I'm in. I'm ready to get to, here are my goals. How do I get there? And then that's what I'm helping them with. I'm not someone who's going to be like, okay, man, what's your number? Because I'm going to call you up every day. Make sure you get out of bed to hit those workouts. That's just not my personality. So I think an important point for business people to make is, who exactly are you? What kind of person are you? What kind of people do you want to work with? And then just stay the course. And maybe it'll take a little bit longer to get to where you want to go, but you're going to be way more satisfied, and you're more likely to stay in business because you're not going to be so frustrated and distraught.
Yeah, you don't want to be the Walmart of your business where you're all things to all people. Because, next thing you know, you got the people Walmart type website happening. These are the people that actually shop with this guy or work with this guy. You don't want to end up being that way, man.
Well, then you get stuck in price wars as well.
Yes,
right?
exactly.
Where someone comes to you like, hey, Sincere, how much do you charge for a 1-month program? And then they come to me, hey, Mike, how much do you charge? And then go to Ken, hey, how much do you charge? And then try to get us all in a battle. Well,
yeah, sadly,
Mike Sincere says he charges this. Okay, I'll charge you less.
And
I don't get into that stuff.
Well, the good thing is, man, I usually don't reply to those emails when someone's shopping, especially for the things that we do. It's like if you got to shop for your health, if it's not that important to you that you got to sit there and just like, well, how much is whatever you're doing here, trying to get from us? How much is it really worth to you? So my thing is, you can't even put a price on that, man. And you can't put a price on all the knowledge that we've acquired over the years and all the money we've invested to get this knowledge for you to come to us as experts. If we really go there, I don't think you want to know the price. So that's the thing about it. So you need to ask yourself.
Avoid all of these people by just charging a lot.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I had to do a guy like that.
I was up to $500 an hour for a private lesson, and people were willing to pay it, by the way.
Yeah.
And I priced it that high because I didn't even want to do it anymore. But I was like, if someone's willing to pay
that doesn't work.
I'll allocate some time towards it. And people were still willing to pay it. I was like, damn, I'm going to have to increase it more because I'm trying to discourage this.
Then you just say, what, I don't do that. Just like, I learned it from
that's what I do now.
Like Shonda Rhimes said, I'm not going to be able to do that. That's her answer for a lot of stuff, man. She's like, I'm busy and I'm not interested in that. That does nothing for me. And it's like, nah, I'm not going to be able to do it. And after that, what can they say?
Well, what happens is you're positioning yourself. So now instead of like everyone is trying to fight for your business, I go, no. I'm not going to fight for your business. You have to fight for my time.
Right.
So I flip the script on people. I go, why should I work with you?
Exactly.
And then all of a sudden, people are not used to that, right? It's kind of like that scene in Boiler Room, Rohit. Remember where Vin Diesel is making that sales pitch to that doctor? Yeah. And then the doctor is like, look, I'm not interested in this. And Vin Diesel's like, well, look, man, here's the kind of growth we're having. And honestly, Doc, I don't even have time to tell you about it, right? And all of a sudden, the doctor's like, well, wait. How do I buy this? So you can – I think what happens is a lot of customers are used to people desperately trying to attain their business. I don't do that crap. I don't do it one bit. If someone comes to me and says, oh, Mike, your testosterone booster is more expensive than this one. I'm like, yeah, mine works. That one doesn't. So which one's better value? You're going to pay more for something that works, or you're going to pay less for something that doesn't work. How is it a better deal to pay less for something that doesn't work? You know,
and that all gets to what I was trying to articulate, which is you're able to become discerning with respect to who you accept as a customer, a client, or a patient, what have you, if you make the necessary investments in your business, whether that be the time to create content, the time or the money to position yourself as an authority. All of that is what I consider to be falling under the umbrella of investing. You know, investing your resources to optimize that facet of it so that you can be discerning and you can measure their return that you get on the time and money that you put in.
But just think about the example of the doctor with the DEXA scan. He could charge a lot more, and then the customer will say, well, hey, why should I pay more for that? It's like, yeah, you can pay less and have someone stick his finger up your ass. How about that? You know? Or you can pay more, get the DEXA scan, and then have a better assessment with less stress. How about that? You know?
Absolutely. Well, the next item in this same sort of framework is I jump to real estate now, because when you think about the framework, always reference back the degree of liquidity and the amount of control. With the degree of liquidity, again, real estate, you can't just go online and push a button. You've got to. You can for sale by owner, if you will, but most people are going to use
you could, but you probably shouldn't, right?
Right.
You could buy an apartment in Dubai online, but it's probably not a good idea.
Exactly. And again, the amount of control you can exert, that's why I put it third under business and career, because you can exert slightly less control in real estate than you can in your business. Some may argue with that, and depending on how astute and experienced they are, that might be true. But the bottom line is that real estate is an area where the market is not as efficient. So there are opportunities for those who really, really spend a lot of time getting to know a certain market, for example, a geographic area and a certain type of real estate. Once you sort of get up to speed, if you see something come on the market that, let's say, it may be underpriced or mispriced, in other words, there may be value there. This can be done in business as well if you're on an acquisition spree, but I didn't talk about that. But the bottom line with real estate is that there are opportunities. They may not be as frequent, but if you are resourceful and you get to know a market, there are legitimate opportunities within the real estate sector to find good rental properties, for example, or properties that may be temporarily underpriced. Or you may be able to add a lot of value because you're familiar with the area, and there may be a property that's lacking X, Y, and Z, and you realize that if you add A, B, and C, you may be able to add a significant amount of value. There's a whole bunch of different ways to sort of look at real estate. But it is something that can be on the radar and in some cases should be on the radar for some people. I always talk about this with some hesitation because with respect to this particular item, it's one of the few out of the areas that we're going to talk about today that when people approach this, they're not going to be paying all cash in most cases. Right. They're generally going to be financing it, and we're going to be talking about debt later and some of the inherent risks and drawbacks of debt, but some of the unique advantages when the opportunities are there to leverage debt. But this is one of those areas where if you bet and get it precisely right, then the debt will magnify the gain in that you borrowed money to do something good, to do something correctly, financially speaking, and you made money. But the problem with real estate is if you bet and you calculate and you bet precisely wrong, that same debt also has the effect of magnifying that loss. And so with real estate, one really, really has to proceed with caution. And so for that reason, I generally recommend that for those that are, adamant about getting into real estate investing, and we're going to talk more about biases and other things in a later topic here, but they really have to take the time to get to know their local market, because real estate is so different even from, if you go 5 miles down the road. Yeah. If I'm out here in Northern Virginia and I've been following the real estate market for a long time, I could literally go even 1 mile down the road and the market and the economics and the rents and the prices and the asset values, they're completely different from just 1 mile up the road.
Right.
And
Or
so,
yeah, or even like here in Texas, one pothole away. You hit one pothole in the road and boom, boom. Or you go right over the railroad track. It's like, whoa, what just happened? I was just in this neighborhood where all the homes were in the millions, and now I just hit this one little pothole, and now all of a sudden they're all like in the low 100s or 200s, and it's just like, and especially with all the gentrification that's going on in all the major cities, and now even the mid-sized cities as well. It's just, and then how long is that going to last? How long is that going to last?
I also think one of the biggest myths that most people believe is that buying a home is the best investment you'll ever make, right? They don't realize how volatile the real estate market is, or at least they should now, given how up and down it's been. I mean, I have neighbors who paid $500,000, $600,000 for their house, and then the valuation after the economy took a big hit dropped to $250,000, and they're still paying a monthly mortgage based on a $500,000 valuation. Some of these people had to dump their houses and they sold it for $250,000, half of what they paid for it. That happened a lot.
And I think it kind of plays into what Rohit was talking about. It's like when you're watching things like that, that can become an opportunity for you as an investor, in real estate, also, a big investment, So it's just like, okay, I'll go ahead and take that house for $250, add a couple little things here and there, and then, rent it out. And then, I got this loan or whatever that I took out for it or whatever then. But the thing is, I already have my own house. So why not have those, make sure you get the right, person in there who and charge the right amount of rent, have them paying that loan out, start doing that. It's kind of like Robert Kiyosaki 101 right there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, a home most certainly is not an investment.
No.
So I think that's a common myth that people miss. But let me clarify that, because it's not accurate to make sort of a sweeping generalization, because there's an argument against it, and it's valid. I mean, the argument against it, like, for example, certain markets like Southern California, markets like London, or markets like New York, a lot of folks in those markets who, and we're talking about a home here as a primary residence, not as an investment. Now, an investment in real estate, when I talk about real estate, I'm talking about investing in real estate. That means that you're not living in it, you're renting it, and you have a tenant that's paying you every month. It's generating cash flow. That is what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about a home as a primary residence. A home, most certainly, for most people, is not an investment. It's actually a huge drain on your cash flow. And but again, when you look at certain markets, those folks probably would argue that my home is probably the best investment that I've ever made, and they'd probably be right, because they're in Southern California or New York or London or another market in San Francisco where they've made a huge sum of money in terms of appreciation. Yeah. So there's some luck involved, there's some geographic disparities involved, but in most parts of the country in the U.S., when we look at the data, as a best case scenario, your home probably will simply just keep up with inflation over a long time horizon. So, some years it might underperform, other years it might outperform, but you're looking at probably somewhere between a 3.5%, maybe 4% growth, depending on where you are in the country. And in some cases, you may not even get that, if you're out in a rural part of the country. So the key with real estate is to recognize it for what it is, depending upon where it is, and you want to focus on price. That's another example that I see. That's another issue that I see. Mike mentioned that you shouldn't be afraid to rent, and I would echo that. And a good example of that would be in markets like San Francisco, for example. One rule of thumb I share with people is when it comes to real estate, you've got to determine asset prices on your own. You've got to think independently, because, as Mike mentioned, the markets can go crazy. And unless you have some framework or some rule of thumb in terms of how to value real estate, you really don't know whether you're right and everybody else is wrong, or if everybody else is right and you're wrong. Yeah. And one rule of thumb that I share with people is when you look at real estate, even if you're looking at it from the vantage point of buying real estate for your own personal residence, use some sort of valuation metric to value that property. And here's an example. This one's really simple. A lot of people don't talk about it, but I really like it because it's so simple. And what I tell people is, when you look at real estate, find out how much rent that property would generate on an annual basis, and then multiply it times a multiplier that you're comfortable with. So here's an example. Let's say you're looking at a house and it might generate about $20,000 a year in gross rent. Well, as a bottom sort of rule of thumb, you want to multiply that times, in some markets, 15. Okay, in some markets 18, in some markets 21. In terms of what that multiplier is, whether it's 15 or 18 or 21, you don't want to necessarily spend more on the price of that home. Okay, and what I mean by that is, let's say in my example, if that property has the potential to generate $20,000 a year in rent, even though you'll probably never rent it, this is just a mechanism to value real estate. So, $20,000 a year times 15 would mean that I'm not going to spend more than $300,000 on this house. So if that $300,000 house is selling for $500,000, something's wrong.
Right.
And it's my opinion that if people had something like that back when the market was going crazy, most of the people that unfortunately, had to deal with the losses that they subsequently had to deal with. We saw the foreclosures and the short sales that resulted from that crisis. They could have avoided that.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying 15 is the multiplier. I mean, in some parts of the country, 15 is not going to get you anywhere in the ballpark. But it might be 18, it might be 21. You've got to find that multiplier for yourself. But the point here is that you've got to have some mechanism. You can't trust the markets, you can't trust even your realtor to define what an appropriate price should be for that home. You've got to determine that for yourself. And another thing that I add on this is you've got to do that and pretend as if you're paying cash for that property.
Yeah.
And because I see this a lot in practice is that people will often, what they do is they will justify poor purchase decisions with superior debt terms. And that is a mistake. And what I mean by that is when it comes to real estate, they'll say, well, hey, I may not be getting a good price, and they may actually know they're not getting a good price, or they might be getting a terrible price, but they're justifying it with all sorts of irrational sort of justifications. One of them, for example, would be, well, you know what? I'm getting great terms on this financing. I'm getting a very, very low interest rate.
Right.
And so I'm just going to make up for what I would lose on the price, and what I would, I'll balance it with what I would gain with these great financing terms. And that is not how the affluent necessarily looks at buying real estate. I mean, if you imagine that you had, let's say, $10 million in cash and financing was not even an issue, in other words, you're not even going to shop for financing. I know most people might not be able to relate to this, but it's just an example. The example is meant to illustrate that in that scenario, you wouldn't even be looking at debt terms or financing terms. You'll simply be looking at the price.
Right.
And not overpaying for that property is what you should be focusing on. Getting a fair price and not overpaying for that real estate. So you've got to have some rule of thumb, and if folks use the simple rule of thumb I gave you, I think that will really serve you, because you'll be asking different questions of the realtor. The realtor probably never even has received questions like this before.
Yeah.
You'll be asking them, hey, listen, I'm interested in buying this house. Tell me, if I had to rent this house, what can I expect in terms of gross rents? And they'll give you a monthly number. You multiply that times 12 and then take it and multiply it times either 15 or 18 or 21 or some other multiplier that's suitable for that geographic area. Come up with your own number and then come up with an offer on that property such that you're not overpaying. That's the key, is don't overpay for assets.
Because most of the time when someone's trying to sell a house, they're just putting an arbitrary number out there, right? They're just saying, well, let's try $700,000 and see what happens.
That's exactly right.
And then if no one's willing to pay that, they're like, okay, let's drop it down to $600,000.
And that's usually what happens, especially if it's been on the market for a certain amount of time. You'll see it when you go look on the listing. It's dropped, and it's a year later, and they've gone down like $150,000, $200,000, and then you start questioning, like, okay, what's the deal here? And it looks kind of bad because then, as the purchaser, they're looking like, okay, something must be wrong with that house. Well, no, that person just really came up with this asinine number that was not based on anything. It just sounded good, or it was based on some wants that they wanted in their personal life. And like, hey, let's sell for $700,000 so we can go ahead and get us a condo in Dubai, So it wasn't realistic,
That's exactly
well, I mean, they're just trying to get the most they can, right? So it's like, why not start high? Someone may pay it. Someone may not do any research, as Rohit is recommending, and just say, screw it. I like the house. Let's just buy it.
Or they make a mistake if they go high and just hope that they'll negotiate. He's like, let me start high because I know they're going to want to go low. So then by the time we negotiate, it'll be somewhere in the middle. Well, that doesn't necessarily carry over in the real estate market like that.
Like in Kenya, you go to buy some arts and crafts out in the middle of nowhere. It starts at $50, and by the time you buy it, it's 50 cents.
Yeah, haggling. Yeah.
That's exactly right. And to drive this point home, and to follow on a point that Mike brought up, which is the thing with real estate is, again, people get emotional about real estate. And when a house is listed, the price could be arbitrary, and oftentimes it is. People are just picking a number because all it takes is one person to buy that. And if that one person has some sort of irrational or emotional response to that property, why would you or how could you compete with them? Why would you want to overpay? So the way to stay rational with real estate, because people fall in love with the house or a home, it's a completely emotional decision. You've got to have a rational way to ground yourself, and using a financial metric like the one I shared, that will help people. But to follow up on a point that Mike brought up, because I think it's so important, is when you look at a market like San Francisco, because you mentioned renting, and people shouldn't be afraid to rent. And renting gets such a bad rap. There's so much negative sort of perceptions around it, which I think is completely unfounded. When you look at a market like San Francisco, it's a great illustration. When you look at a house or an apartment, for example, that's selling for 1.2 million or 2 million or 3 million, some of these astronomical figures for which properties in certain geographies sell for. But then when you look at that same property and find out, well, what would it cost me to simply rent this? And if that is like something closer to like $3,000 a month or $3,500 a month or $4,000 a month, in other words, the cost of renting and the disparity that exists between renting and buying is so huge. If you bought that property, you'd have a loan for, let's say, $12,000, $13,000 a month, or you could rent it for significantly less. In those cities, in those geographies, I'm giving an extreme example just to drive the point home. Most cities are not like this, but many cities around the world are. You'd be crazy not to rent that same property, because you could, as long as you take, and this is the caveat, as long as you take the difference and invest it elsewhere. So that's the discipline. So let's say you're saving $3,000 a month by renting somewhere and not buying. Well, the purchaser, the buyer, they perceive that they're building equity. It may even be phantom equity that actually doesn't exist, because until you sell that property and cash out, you really have no verifiable equity. But when you rent and you're saving money each month, the key is to take that excess cash flow and put it to good use, whether that be, again, in yourself, in your business, or the capital markets, or in other rental real estate, in something, so that you're actually making progress and not just taking that excess savings and flushing it down the toilet.
No doubt.
So the last item here that I sort of share in this framework is the most common sort of investment outlet, if you will, that everybody sort of shares, which is the capital markets, right? The stock markets, the bond markets. And so once you've sort of gone through this framework in the order in which I shared, the capital markets would be towards the bottom of that, only because if you think about the degree of liquidity and the amount of control, this is where it becomes really important. The degree of liquidity, the capital markets generally are extremely efficient, right? You can go online and buy and sell pretty much whatever you want, whenever you want, right? So it's an efficient market. And the amount of control you can exert, I would argue you really can't exert too much control. I'm going to share with listeners today where they can exert control, and so that they have some concrete items to walk away with. But the capital markets would be on the bottom here, simply because you've got less control, you've got more liquidity, so you've got less opportunity, I would argue, to sort of influence the outcome as you could, whether if you were investing in yourself, in your business, your career, or real estate. Okay. So with that in mind, shall we talk about retirement?
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's do that.
Well, some people are probably never going to retire.
Exactly.
Well, me, I'm semi-retired now.
Exactly.
Cool, take that.
Yeah, and I want to share some strategies that I hopefully will help folks not only build a retirement plan for it, but succeed when they get there.
Right.
And so let me just define retirement for a minute, because people define it differently, and it means different things to different people. When most people talk about retirement, they're talking about it in the context of, work stops completely, and then you kind of transition to something else. Another way to define retirement would be having the ability to work because you want to and not necessarily because you have to.
Right.
Which I like a lot.
Yeah, no doubt.
And that is a powerful position to be in, and that's a position that I think we can all aspire to.
I think it's always important to work, right? Because I remember, a little bit of a tangent, but I remember my grandfather was a very successful consultant for Fortune 500 companies, and he loved his work. He traveled the world meeting with CEOs, high-level business people. And then when he retired, there was a real shift in his excitement for life. Because when he retired, he didn't just work less, he stopped working altogether. And I really felt like he devalued himself, meaning that he didn't have much purpose anymore, because he is someone who enjoyed his work so much. He's not someone who just did a job he hated for 40 years, like, I can't wait to retire so I can finally enjoy life. He enjoyed what he was doing. So the lesson I learned from him is definitely pursue what you want to do in life, but there's no real reason to stop it completely.
There you go.
You can do something else, maybe write books, maybe consult a lot less, and maybe just work when you feel like working, but you're still working.
I like that. That is one of my favorite ways to think about retirement.
Yeah.
Because it really is maybe the most powerful position you can be in when you have enough assets to do what you want when you want, because you want to and not because you have to.
Right.
And the other thing I like about thinking about retirement that way is, as you sort of get there, you can do things not only that you want to do, but you can take on riskier projects along the way.
No doubt.
And what I mean by that is, risk and return are related, right? As a finance guy, we know that to be true.
Sure.
But financial theory generally dictates that the older that we get, the more conservative we have to become, because we're getting older, our circumstances are changing, therefore we can't be as aggressive. But when you have a retirement sort of framework in place in the way that I'm going to share with you, and if you think about it in that light, then you can actually reverse that to some extent. You can actually take on more riskier projects, more interesting projects, however you want to define it. You can innovate, because even if it doesn't work out, then it's not the end of the world, right?
There's a blackjack player in Vegas, Rohit, who he's the most successful blackjack player ever. I mean, he's almost put casinos out of business. There's a documentary about him on Netflix. Anyway, what this guy does is he has very smart. He doesn't count cards. I thought he must be a great counter. He doesn't even count cards. What he does is creates strategies that work in his favor, such as he gets back 50% of all of his losses. Right? If the dealer makes a mistake, they have to redo the bet, win or lose. It's just different strategies, just different ways to make the game work in his favor. But what he says he does is, once he gets ahead, so he sits down, once he has a spread, in other words, he's won a certain amount, now he really starts getting aggressive with risks, rather than the second he sits down at the table, because he's so far ahead now. And I found out to be the same, right? Like, early in my business, I didn't take a lot of risks because I didn't have any money to risk. You're just getting by. Now I can take much bigger risks. I can take way bigger risks because I can handle that. If it doesn't work out, worst case scenario, I can put several $100,000 into something. If it doesn't work out, it's not the end of the world. I'm not going to be happy about it, but it's not the end of the world. So I get completely what you're saying.
And it's liberating to be in that position. There's a sense of freedom that comes, and there's a sense of satisfaction, even work satisfaction, that comes from being in that position. And that's what I want to sort of deconstruct and share with folks, how to get there so that they have some sort of roadmap. And so let me share a few strategies. Generally, I'm going to introduce folks to a concept called sustainable withdrawal rates. And it's a concept that most financial advisors will chat with clients on as they're sort of a few years away from retirement, if you will. It's something because it relates to, there's three phases generally. There's the accumulation phase of wealth, there's the preservation phase of wealth, and then there's the distribution phase. And this relates mainly to the distribution phase, but I like to talk about it first because Stephen Covey said, the way to succeed is to begin with the end in mind.
Mm-hmm.
And so let's talk about withdrawal rates. You guys there?
Yeah, we're right here.
Okay, great.
Yeah, right here. I just have it on mute in case my dog's. Whenever you're talking, Rohit, I just mute it in case one of my dogs starts barking, because I've got some people doing some yard work around here as well.
Okay, yeah, no problem. So withdrawal rates, what does that mean? So basically what that means is if you begin with the end in mind, it becomes much easier to construct your sort of retirement strategy, if you will, however you define it. So basically, let me give you two extreme examples, and most people will be somewhere in between, but it's helpful to kind of illustrate with two extreme examples. So one individual says, listen, when my time is up on this planet, when that date of expiration comes, the last check I write on this planet, on this earth, before I leave, should bounce. I should time my withdrawal and distribution of assets such that, that last check bounces. I don't want anything left. I don't want it, because I can't take it with me when I'm gone. So I want to draw down on everything. He's not concerned, or she's not concerned in that example with preserving wealth across multiple generations. The other extreme is a more conservative person that says, hey, listen, I've built this nest egg, I've built this asset base, and I want to preserve the principles such that multiple generations can live off this. I don't want to deplete it such that I don't have anything to pass along to charities or future generations. I want these assets to remain as they are. So I only want to spend the amount that will enable me to preserve the amount that I originally saved, adjusted for inflation. So those are the two extremes. Now, most people are going to be somewhere in between. But why do I bring this up in the context of retirement? Because if you begin with this concept, then you can sort of work backwards from there. So, for example, that conservative person is going to have a much lower withdrawal rate on his or her assets than that person who says, hey, listen, the last check I write on this planet should bounce, because they're ready to draw down everything. Does that make sense? So basically, that number, whatever that number is, whether it's 2%, whether it's 7%, whatever that number is, somewhere in the middle or somewhere higher or lower. Right. It's a point of controversy in the community, so I'm not going to get into specific numbers because it varies from client to client, and it varies based on when you retire. So, but that will help you begin with the end in mind. So, for example, let's just say, you could live off of $100,000 a year, and you've got a portfolio that you've built of $2.5 million. Well, if you have $2.5 million and you can live off $100,000 a year, then you could theoretically draw down about 4% a year and have some reasonable basis to extend that portfolio over a long time horizon,
right?
Okay, 30 or more years. And so, without getting into too many specifics, that is where folks should begin, because if you can define what you want your withdrawal rate to be and where you are in that continuum, then you can back into the number and the answer to the most common question I get, which is, how much do I need to save to be able to retire? So that is the answer to that. So the answer to that is, well, if you can figure out what number you're comfortable with respect to a withdrawal rate and how long you need to preserve those assets, you can back into how much do I need to save to get there. And so that's beginning with the end in mind. One last framework I share on this topic is, how do you break that down? Because, getting to such a large esoteric number is so overwhelming for most people.
Yeah.
And unless you break it down, it can be overwhelming. So one of the things I share with folks to break that down into smaller nuggets is, if having an asset base to be able to do what we want when we want, because we want to and not because we have to, if that's the goal, then how do we get there? Well, start somewhere. So what I tell clients is, start with, let's say, a year or two. So if you know what your expenses are to live, your lifestyle expenses, let's just say, for example, they're $50,000. I'm making up a number. So that means that once you've got $100,000 set aside, well, that push comes to shove, you could go 2 years without having to work. without having to generate an income, right? Because you've got 100,000 set aside. So once you've got a base, then simply work towards extending that base 1 year at a time. So that's how you slowly work your way up to extending that sort of freedom, that financial independence, if you will, 1 year at a time, to the point where you have enough assets so that they can last you for the remaining time horizon that you've defined for yourself. So eventually you'll have 3 years, and then you'll know you're 4 years away from having to work. Then one day you'll be 8 years away from having to work. And as you slowly push that further and further away, so you've got more years that you can go without having to work if you don't want to, that's going to give you sort of a bite size, how do you eat an elephant, one bite at a time. You can kind of break that down to figure out, okay, here's how I'm going to break this big goal into small pieces.
I think that's a good way to look at really any goal, right?
Right.
Like someone wants to take their deadlift from 400 pounds to 500 pounds. You don't think of adding 100 pounds in a month. You think of a much longer time frame. Think of a more realistic time frame, such as maybe 5 pounds a month, and then you have a clear idea of where you're going. So I think with anything, you have to have a clearly defined goal and then a time frame on when you want to make it happen. And whether it takes longer or it takes less is somewhat irrelevant. You just need to have that target in your mind so that you're focused.
Absolutely. In the same spirit, one of the things I like to share with clients is to recognize the difference between gambling and investing, because we're talking about investing. Yeah. So this is a big one.
So if you're playing blackjack, you're gambling, unless you're counting cards. Then it's investing.
Then you're investing.
Absolutely, and I kind of take it one step even further, and I try to clarify something that clients don't necessarily ask me, but it's there in that. We may not necessarily be aware of this, but until I share it with them, then once they become aware of it, they can sort of think about this more clearly. And here's what I share with clients is that there's two extremes here. So let me give you an example. One extreme is that you've got someone that's really conservative in their career, but they're aggressive with what they think is investing. So an example would be, let's say they're not really focused on growing their business or their career, but instead they're checking out early, and then from 4 to 12 they're focused on day trading and options investing, or they're at the casino trying to hit it big. They call it investing, I call it gambling, because I'm going to talk about what investing is in a moment. But that would be one extreme, and that's the exact opposite from another example, which would be the aggressive entrepreneur that's exerting a lot of control over their business and focusing on growing it and taking on those risky projects that could potentially pay off big because they can exert their intellect, their influence on those projects and the outcome of those projects. But they're not gambling, and they're not doing day trading and options, from 4 to 10. Instead, they're pragmatic with their investing. And notice I said pragmatic, not conservative. So I'm not talking about conservative investing. I'm talking about pragmatism. And there's a difference. And so that's an important distinction to be aware of, because in my opinion, it's far better to be aggressive in your career and pragmatic with your investing rather than being conservative with your career but aggressive with your investing. And I see this all the time.
Yeah, you have way more control on your career than investing, right? The market, who knows what's going to happen?
Exactly.
It's very emotional.
Exactly. You got to focus on where the big bets are. I mean, to borrow from fitness, again, and I don't pretend to be an expert. I'm not, but it's analogous to going into the gym, and instead of focusing on deadlifts and squats and presses and those few exercises that produce the most bang for your buck, instead you go in and all you do is tricep pull downs and bicep curls,
Right.
and that's but I see this so often that it's worthwhile to mention it. And so you got to focus on the right things that pay off the most. And Warren Buffett has a great example on this. He talks about, and I'm paraphrasing here, he talks about, is it better to be an average member of a superior ship or a superior member of an average ship? And the example he gives is, if you're an average employee at a hedge fund, you're probably going to do pretty well for yourself. But if you're the outstanding employee of the month, at let's just say, I don't know, some place that doesn't pay really well, that doesn't have the wherewithal to pay, you're probably not going to do very well, right? Yeah. And so it's the difference between sort
of in fitness. I mean, Westside Barbell Club is the most elite powerlifting gym in the country, right? Or if not the world. And the average guy there bench presses 550 and deadlifts 750, right? So you're better off being that guy than the strongest guy at the local gym. I go
24-hour fitness.
Where I'm probably the strongest guy. I'm not close to those numbers.
Yeah, that's because of who your peers are, right? And one example I like to give on this is that the paddle boat versus a speedboat. You could optimize and become as proficient as possible at getting that paddle boat to go as fast as you could, but but when you compare that to not having really any clue on how to operate a speedboat, the speedboat probably still will get you there faster simply because the economics of that boat are different. And so you got to think about what you're focusing on. And so, you got to frame investing in the light in which it's going to actually pay off. So I'd be happy to chat more and talk about those areas that you can control in investing. You guys like to talk about that?
Yeah, sure. Let's see. As long as you have the time, man, we're good. We're at about an hour right now, so we'll probably cap it off at usually like to cap episodes off at about the 90-minute mark. So what we can do is if we don't cover everything you wanted to get into, we'll just bring you back.
Okay. Well, let me see here. Let me look at some of the other areas that we can talk about. So let me skip a few things on the sort of tactics involving investing, because for those who are interested, I've got some free resources and reports.
Cool.
They can always sort of follow up and read on those topics, if you will. But let me just share a couple of big picture things that might resonate with more people rather than getting into specifics. So one of the other things I like to talk about and share with people is to recognize your own biases. And so, this plays out with investing. Because what we find is that some people have sort of these affinities for, let's say, art, affinities for real estate, or they have sort of irrational fears of the stock market, or it might be cultural. It might be even organizational. For example, because you're surrounded by people in the same company, everybody's sort of following the same sort of approach, so you have to at least ask yourself, if I'm making certain decisions, is it because I've got some predisposed biases, and are those biases helping me or hurting me?
Right.
We see this all the time. I give an example from my own father. He had a long career at a well-known tech company, and he had basically a accumulated stock position in that company that had accumulated over 20 years working for WorldCom, believe it or not.
Yeah.
And so basically what happened is he had accumulated a significant amount of stock in this company. I don't talk about the numbers, but let's just say it was a very, very significant amount, such that it was a concentrated position in this company. And a lot of people find themselves in this position. In fact, I'm shocked to see how many people find themselves in this position. They might be putting all their money into art, for example. They might put all their money into real estate because they have a bias that says that, hey, listen, unless I can touch it, see it, and feel it, I'm not going to invest in it, right? So long story short, when I was younger, you guys all know the story of the WorldCom and Enrons of the world.
Oh, yeah.
They crashed and burned, and to my father's surprise, he lost in that transaction approximately 90% or more of his retirement. Yeah. And that really became the motivating force for me in terms of, my why, in terms of why I do this. And I was surprised. Well, after that event, I probably read at least 200 books on investing in the 12 months following that event, when I saw my dad's assets, basically disappear overnight. And when I got into practice later, after I became a CPA and I started working at Price Waterhouse, I was I was sure that an event like that, an affinity bias like that, or a concentrated equity position, financial planners call it single stock risk, because there was a bias in that organization that this company is fantastic, that everybody was kind of, sort of drinking the Kool-Aid, if you will, right? That's the bias that existed in that organization. And I was sure that it was sort of an isolated incident, but I was shocked when I saw client after client. I mean, literally after working with hundreds of clients, I'm surprised to see how many times I see this. I still see it. And so you've got to ask yourself, am I suffering from some sort of bias? Is it helping me or hurting me? And am I being objective?
Yeah. With stocks, though, just a little tangent here. With stocks, does anyone really beat, let's say, a total stock market index or a Fortune 500 index, such as what Vanguard offers, right? Like, these aren't things that people get excited about, but in the long run, does anyone beat these?
Yeah, well, let's talk about that. Since you brought it up, let's just talk about investing then. The answer is that, let me share with you the factors that people can control. Because as you point out, most people are not going to be successful with market timing or stock picking or attempting to beat the indices. The data shows, and folks that are interested can actually read the data. I'm happy to send it to them. They can go to my website and download all that information. But basically, the data supports that the vast majority of the time, most quote-unquote active managers cannot beat the index. They do not beat the index. Right. And the data varies from one year to the next, changes and updates every year. But then the data further shows that when those specific managers in those specific asset classes do beat the index, oftentimes it's just attributed to luck. Yeah. And that luck does not persist, right? And so it's not correct to infer from.
And then if you look at the fees you have to pay those managers versus the low fees on the index, you're probably still not even ahead.
Right.
Exactly. So let me share with you some of the factors you can control, and I'll go down these quickly because I know we only have about 10 minutes. So
yeah, we don't have to cut it off at the 10-minute mark. I'm just giving you a time frame, so don't feel rushed.
Okay. So if you can't control the stock market, if you can't market time, if you can't pick stocks, and if people that attempt to tell you that they do have that crystal ball when they don't. A lot of active managers may purport to have a crystal ball, but like I said, the data supports that most of the time they underperform the index. You'd be simply better off buying the index, right, which is a lot cheaper, which we'll get into. Then what factors can you control if you can't control those? Well, you can control your cash reserves, right? And so I always recommend to have a nice, healthy cash reserve, not just for emergencies, but also for unique opportunities. Yeah. Because you never know when unique opportunities to, come across your desk or present themselves. Yeah. And you want to be able to take advantage of those. You can only take advantage of those if you can quickly tap, some sort of cash reserve, or you have some degree of liquidity to do so. Another factor you can control is your asset allocation, which simply means, do you have a balanced portfolio? What asset classes have you introduced to your portfolio? And so asset classes in some studies, asset allocation in some studies has been shown to be attributed to more than 90% of your outcome when it comes to investing. So that's pretty powerful. Yeah. If you think about that, people generally are spending their time, energy, and resources on those items like, stock picking and market timing, when the vast majority, upwards of potentially 90%, is simply attributed to asset allocation, based on some studies. And so, again, focus on the things that make the most difference. You can focus on your response to market fluctuations. This is called behavioral finance. So basically, you can control your emotional, irrational responses to market fluctuations. That, one way to do that is to turn off your television.
There you go.
That's good advice regardless of the context.
Because what happens is we see clients, they're watching CNBC, they're watching, the shows online, and
my dad does that all day.
Oh,
every day he turns on CNN, he's on there. Because he likes to play with stocks every day, right? And he has a tendency, in terms of a bias, he has a tendency to remember all the times that worked out.
It noticed the times that didn't, right?
Yeah. Well, like most gamblers. Most gamblers are like, whenever I do this, I win. I was like, yeah, but 90% of the time you're losing, buddy.
And that gets back to the biases that we have, that we develop and keep. What happens is when people are watching these shows, they're responding emotionally or irrationally to all of the information. So they're basically taking a prudent plan and changing it unnecessarily.
Yeah.
And the key with a prudent plan is to develop one and then stick to it over a long period of time. Another factor you can control is the cost of investing. And Mike just brought this up, which is so powerful. If you're a do-it-yourselfer when it comes to investing, you'd be well advised to simply use index funds.
Yeah.
They're super low cost. You can implement an asset class based approach. We obviously take it one step further as a professional wealth management firm, but do-it-yourselfers can do very, very well simply using index funds. Vanguard is a great resource for that, as Mike mentioned.
I mean, it's what I'm doing as a self-employed person. I can maximize it every year, right? So I can lower my taxable income by just maximizing how much I can put into it. And I don't look at it. I probably look at the portfolio once a year, and that's when I'm putting the money in during tax time. I don't look at it daily or weekly or monthly like a lot of other people, because that's what's going to make you start fiddling around with stuff. And it just ruins it. It's like, things. Plus, it's an index fund, so what am I going to do? If it's dropping, I'm going to sell it. Then buy what? You're investing in the market going up as a whole over time, so there really isn't much to do with it.
Exactly, and that speaks to where do returns come from? Returns come from markets, right? Not necessarily managers who are attempting to purport to
but also, my time is better spent on things I have control over, just like what you mentioned, Rohit, such as product development, pushing my products, developing the podcast. Those things are things that are going to make me the most money, way more so than investing, and those are things that I actually have some control over.
That's exactly right. And that goes back to those two approaches. Are you going to be the aggressive entrepreneur and pragmatic with your investing, or the conservative person who's aggressive with investing, right? Which approach is better, or is somewhere in the middle?
As I'm listening to you talk, I'm patting myself on the back. I like the way
I'm sitting here smiling. I'm like, my wife's going to love listening to this episode. It's like,
That's awesome. That's great. That's fantastic. Another example of something you can control is your tax strategy, right? That's important. You should be proactive with that. You can control your fixed income strategy. I see a lot of clients. This is an area where we see a lot of clients deficient. We see clients overestimating their risk tolerance, and so they're deficient with their fixed income portion or their bond portion. They're too aggressive because they overestimate the amount of volatility that they can effectively endure. And then when the markets tank, they start changing a prudent plan, and then they fall further and further behind. You see this with clients who basically, when the markets contract, they just take all their money, they sell out of the markets, and then they park all their money in cash.
We see this with people training too, right? Like, you might be on a good training regimen, and let's say third week, for whatever reason, there's a dip, meaning that your body is in the adaptation phase, and then you go into an alarmist state, thinking that the program is not working and that you're in a decline, and then you switched gears. When if you stuck around one more week, you would have started seeing the turnaround. You would have hit the turning point. So a lot of people quit right before the turning point.
Absolutely. And that's not the way to implement an investment strategy, right? Because it produces the exact opposite results you're looking for. Yeah. The financial markets, ultimately, they tell a very powerful, positive story over long periods of time.
Right.
So to be able to stay the course is the key, and a fixed income strategy is part of that. So what we generally recommend with clients is to have a thoughtful fixed income plan, short-term maturities, high-quality bonds. The role of your fixed income strategy should effectively be to dampen the volatility associated with that equity stock market investing, and ultimately to reduce the risk and reduce that bumpy ride along the way. Another example of a factor that you can control is rebalancing. If your portfolio drifts from that initial investment policy that you created, then you can bring it back to where your investment policy dictates it should be, which means sort of sometimes selling the winners and buying the losers, or the other way around. You'd bring that portfolio back from its drift. And so these are a bunch of things, or examples of a bunch of things that you can control. So be conscientious of trying to do too much of the things that you can't necessarily control, and focus on the things that you can control.
I think people have a tendency to get overwhelmed by what they can't control, whether it's investing or other areas of life, when the obvious thing to do is to focus on what you can control. But it seems like there's a disconnect often.
Right. Absolutely. So another concept, and guys, I have so much material here. So when you guys feel that it's appropriate to conclude this, just let me know, because I could share so many strategies with folks.
Well, if you hear a snoring sound, that's my dog.
Absolutely. I know a lot of this can get a little thick, but
no, it's interesting stuff. I mean, if it's boring to you, then that's a problem, honestly.
Right.
Because it shouldn't be boring to you. If you're an adult listening to this show, this should be something that you find very interesting.
You should get your mind going right now and make you start asking yourself some serious questions like, okay, what am I doing currently? Am I making the right decisions? Or, I thought I was doing the right thing, but now Rohit just pointed out that, okay, I'm messing up right here. So now you should be asking yourself, okay, what do I do next? So
absolutely.
Because I think a lot of people don't plan stuff. They just hope for the best.
Or they just wing it. They're just winging it,
Effective. Yeah, exactly. They're winging it or just hoping for the best. Like, things will work out.
Yeah, it'll work.
Positive thoughts. It's like, no, positive actions.
Yeah, exactly.
Not positive thoughts.
No, it's all in the planning and implementation, much like everything else. Well, why don't I change gears and talk about something different, like debt? That's something that is.
Oh man! It's like it's almost to the point where I'm like, can you really cover this in like 10 minutes, man? Because honestly, all this other, like everything we've talked about up until this point, it seems like it's one of those things, in my opinion, that should come after we talk about addressing debt. Because especially in this country, because this is a very debt-rich, there's a paradox to use right there, country.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I could literally, spend hours talking about hundreds of different strategies, but I'm trying to cherry pick those that would be most beneficial or resonate with the most people. But when talking about debt, most financial planners, what I hear and see in the media is they categorize debt in terms of good debt versus bad debt.
Yeah.
And I'm not opposed to that categorization. However, I've got a different sort of take on debt in general. And that is that, at some point, we should all aspire to be simply debt-free. And, regardless of the financial ramifications, I mean, I don't, I support the good debt versus bad debt, the interest rates and the mathematical sort of justification for, why some folks might want to carry a long mortgage. I don't disagree with it, but looking at debt in sort of a deeper psychological view, there are non-financial reasons to simply eliminate debt. And I'm a big proponent of doing so, because my philosophy on debt is that debt is much like any other obligation.
Right.
It effectively it affects your thought process. It affects your response to certain things. I'll give you an example.
I think it affects your confidence. I think debt, to a large extent, is modern day slavery, right?
Yeah,
how can you be free when you owe someone money?
Exactly.
Like I have neighbors who are like, yeah, I own my house. I'm like, do you still have a mortgage? They're like, yeah. Then I'm like, then you don't own the house. You own the house when you don't owe anyone for it. The bank owns your house right now, and then you're paying them.
And if you have an HOA, you'll never own your house. So that's another thing, because as soon as you do something that the HOA gets pissed off about, they can take your house. So guess what? You don't own a house.
Yeah.
It's interesting. When I was a kid, my dad used to sing a song before he'd go out the door every day. He would say, I owe, so off to work I go. And I never forgot that, because I asked him later in life when I got older, I said, Dad, if I simply never owe anybody anything, then I can pretty much do whatever I want, right?
You don't have to go anywhere. You can stay home.
Exactly.
But there is some validity to that, in that when you're obligated by debt, you sort of got to get up and take care of that obligation, whereas eliminating debt does sort of liberate folks. I see this with clients when we look at – I'll give you some concrete examples, because I think this will be interesting and insightful. People don't talk about it. Yeah. When I have clients who sort of are timid in marketing, or are a little gun-shy when it comes to growing their business, because they're so conscientious of the business loan, the practice loan, the home loan. They're constantly thinking about the next payment. They don't want to take the necessary risks that are involved to grow a business aggressively. What happens is, when we remove the debt and all of a sudden they have that feeling of liberation, those clients who were conservative by nature because of the debt now all of a sudden become much more aggressive. And what happens is by getting rid of the debt, they become more aggressive and start generating greater incomes, sometimes significantly more income, because they're completely uninhibited, if you will. They're liberated, right? They don't have to deal with the obligation. It's almost like taking a private company public. All of a sudden you were completely independent, you're running a private company, and now all of a sudden you've got to answer to the stockholders or deal with the board of directors.
I've always wondered why some companies even bother going public. I mean, that's probably like another 2 hours.
Exactly.
I'll tell you, some of them really, really regret it if it wasn't for the right reasons. And you have to think about debt, and the reason I bring it up in this way is when you think about debt, you have to think about it both in financial terms and in non-financial terms. So there may not always be a financial justification to get rid of the debt, but what about the other benefits of getting rid of the debt, right? What about that person that feels liberated, that's more aggressive in business now, that doesn't feel like they have any obligations holding them back? These all have to be considered when looking at debt. So my general, sort of thought on this is we should all aspire at some point to become debt-free, simply because it just adds a degree of a liberating effect, if you will, and it helps with cash flow planning.
Well, I mean, it's kind of like someone who has had excess weight for a long time, and then you lose it, and you're healthier. That's liberating as well. Right? You're healthy, you're energetic. I mean, being strong and healthy and having a vibrancy and energy, that's very liberating, and that's going to improve your business or anything else you're trying to take charge of.
Trust me, carrying that excess weight, that's more debt. That's because one thing about it, look at that. Now you're a slave to the healthcare system. You're a slave to your insurance company, because now you can't get the insurance you really want because you're a high risk, or, you're constantly going to the doctor. You constantly have to buy medication. So, and that's putting you in financial debt more and more as well. So, like I said,
it's more energy you have to waste just to do simple things.
Walk up the stairs,
Yeah, exactly.
You're taxing your heart. So, so taxing, So, yeah.
That's exactly right. There are examples where debt can be advantageous, so I don't want to discount this. Again, everything I'm sharing are just general rules of thumbs, and there's always exceptions. But example will be with real estate investing. For those who are really experienced and astute real estate investors, the seasoned pros, if you will, they can very intelligently use debt to acquire real estate they otherwise wouldn't be able to.
Right. Even in the context of a business, Rohit, I mean, the only times I've ever gone in debt were for business purposes, right? Like early in my career, there were times where I had to play the credit card shuffle game to stay afloat. But that was for business. It wasn't because I went out and bought a new car or I'm going to too many expensive dinners. It was because
it's very calculated.
I'm not making enough money with my business, so I have to be strategic so I can keep moving forward. And then you have a timeline on when you're going to pay this stuff back and be free of it all.
Absolutely. And what I would add to that is in business, sometimes using debt, again, this is more for the seasoned pros, if you will, that really, really know their numbers. We see businesses use debt very, very successfully. These are generally the businesses who know their customer acquisition costs cold. They know their numbers, their metrics, their key performance indicators cold. I mean, they really are hyper analytical, and they know that in their business, they've got a scenario where, listen, if I put $10 into my business in marketing or advertising, I can acquire $100 of revenue. And I can do that all day long, but I simply don't have enough cash on hand to do it more than I can. And so if I take out a loan of $1 million or $2 million and simply inject it into my business, I know that I'm getting a 10-to-1 return for every dollar I put in. So even after paying the interest on that debt, I can grow my business exponentially. And that might be another example of many that where debt can be advantageous. But generally speaking, personally speaking, it's probably prudent to at some point create a plan to eliminate or reduce all debt, no matter what it is, no matter what rate of interest you're getting. Just get rid of it.
I don't even like to take loans to grow my business, which is like anytime I launch a new product, I'm paying for that myself. I'm not going to the bank and saying, hey, let me get a loan to launch this, because my attitude is that why am I launching a new product if the last 4 are not profitable yet?
Right.
I should be able to use the profit from that to finance the next deal. And what's funny is that the bank calls me up all the time, but not because I owe them money, it's because they want to lend me money.
Exactly. Hey, so constantly go to the mailbox and there's always this new offer like, hey, come in today and get this low rate. I'm like, no, dude, I'm good.
The branch manager called me up, and I never responded. I went into the bank to take care of some paperwork, and she's like, hey, you're a hard guy to get a hold of. I'm like, yeah. I was like, I'm a young, smart, successful guy. I don't need your money.
I want to talk to you.
I was like, where were you guys when I was in debt 12 years ago?
Exactly.
That's exactly.
Wouldn't even talk to you.
Well, let me share two final frameworks, and then maybe we can come to a conclusion here.
Yeah, sure,
I'll just spend a few minutes on each. And one other framework or concept that I want to share is an awareness of managing the pursuit of upside versus the mitigation of downside.
Yeah.
And folks don't necessarily ask this question, but when I make them aware of it, it helps them tremendously. And what I mean by that is when we think about investing, when we think about money, most people are focused only on the upside side of the equation. But when you look at Warren Buffett's number one rule of investing is never lose money.
Right.
And his number two rule of investing is never forget rule number one. Right. And so and
I think a lot of people have a misconception about someone like a Warren Buffett, thinking he must be a real risk taker and putting it all on the line. And then I think Tony Robbins has a new book out on investing, and I didn't buy it because I didn't think it was worth buying, but I did skim through it at the bookstore, and there were some good tips on there. And the one thing he said is that these really good financial advisors and investors, they don't take big risks. They play things smart, like the way Warren Buffett plays the game.
Yeah, that's a critical piece of the puzzle. And that what that speaks to is not just always thinking about upside, but also thinking about downside. I call them financial mistakes.
Yeah.
Right. And I tell people that, listen, isn't it interesting that Warren Buffett's rules about investing all have to deal with the management of downside? In other words, not losing money.
Right.
And that's something to be very cognizant of, because I see this so often in practice. And really what there are is just financial mistakes, because financial mistakes and having an awareness of the impact of a financial mistake, it can take years to recover from.
Yeah.
It can take sometimes decades. I gave the example of my dad, who lost his entire retirement due to a concentrated equity position. That was devastating for him. Okay, it took decades to rebuild that. And so what I share with clients is, listen, you've got to think about the things that you're doing in terms of not only the potential upside, but also the potential downside. If you're going to go out on a whim and buy an interest in a new restaurant business, let's talk about the money you could make, but also the amount of money you could lose if it doesn't go as planned, right?
Right.
Because
there's a good chance it won't go as planned either. So that's definitely worth being cognizant of.
You got to think about the downside. You can't ignore it. So in this context, you have to think about the need for insurance, whether it's health, disability, life, long-term care, business insurance, professional liability insurance. Some may need to work with an estate planner. Most clients don't even have a will. It's surprising to me. They don't have any asset protection plan or wealth transfer plan. So these are items to put on the to-do list if you've never looked into it. Another item which you guys, I'll defer to you guys on, which is something I actually see. I've seen it in practice over 15 years because I work with business owners. But I also put in this sort of list here, managing your own health, because downside financially, you'd be surprised how often I see business owners, because I work almost 95% exclusively with business owners, and there's something about being a business owner, I don't know what it is, but it puts a unique type of stress on an individual. It's interesting. I had a conversation with a physician, and I would just ask him socially. I said, it's interesting, haven't you ever thought about starting your own practice, or have you thought about self-employment and building your own practice? And he told me, he said, you know what? I've worked so much with clients with patients over the years that I've seen the effect that self-employment and being in business can have. And after I'm working with patients who are kind of dealing with whether it be burnout or whether it be some sort of I don't even know how to define it.
I mean, those are people who aren't playing the game right, because I was under way more stress when I worked for other people. I think it's a personality shift. Also, I mean, I used to think the same way when I looked at business owners when I was a kid. It just looked like they worked all the time, 7 days a week. Their employees get to go home. They're still working. You have to play this game with a smarter strategy than that. For the first, let's say, 4 years of my self-employment career in the fitness business, I worked 7 days a week, worked my ass off, teaching courses every weekend, you name it. That's what it took to build my name and get things going. But I was able to pull back in the reins around 2006 and then pick and choose options more so. Now my lifestyle is freer than ever. Pretty much all of my income is based on my nutrition supplement line. To a large extent, that's passive. And I only have to do a few things actively to keep that money train going. So I have less stress now than I've ever had, period.
I think it comes down.
It's all about how you roll it.
Yeah, it comes down to being efficient again. And as Rohit, like you mentioned earlier, it's about having that end goal in mind. Now, a lot of times, I don't think a lot of folks who jump into the entrepreneur and, game really think about that end goal in mind other than I want to be my own boss. I want to make my own money. I don't want to answer to anyone. And I think in terms of what that doctor was saying, I think there's a high percentage of people who take great comfort in being just told what to do and knowing that's going to be, this is their everyday job. They have to come in and do this, and they go back home with no responsibility compared to the business owner who's constantly got to think, okay, marketing, what I got to do next? How am I going to build my income? Yeah, exactly.
Here's the kicker. None of that is stressful to me, though.
No, that gets me excited.
It's always on my mind, but that's not stressful.
Yeah, exactly.
At all. I like that it's always on my mind.
Yeah.
You know that feeling you get right before you're about to give a lecture to a big group of people? A lot of people are panicked in that situation. They're petrified of that. I like that feeling.
Yeah,
well, I think
it's all your perspective, basically, is where I'm going.
Yeah,
I think that's a key insight, which is for those that are dealing with those issues and finding themselves stressed by them. The question is, how do I go from being stressed by them to not being stressed by them?
Well, it's possible that it's not for you. I always say entrepreneurship is not for everybody. It's not like I sell everybody on, hey, man, you should quit your job and do this. Each person has to decide for him or herself whether that's the best way to go. And for a lot of people, it's not the way to go. They don't have it. They don't have the mentality to handle it, just like I don't have the mentality to work for someone else.
Yeah, you got to ask yourself, why is this stressing to you? And then again, I think it also goes back to what we were talking about earlier about the biases as well. Like, is it not for you because, that's what you truly believe, or is that what you've always been told? Have you been fed that by your parents, like, you need to get a real job and blah, that's not for you and blah, blah, blah. Those people, do you understand? They lose everything and blah, blah, blah. You need some security, so exactly.
Some people will say you have to work so much harder to make less, right? That's another one of those misnomers out there. And my attitude is, yeah, right. Nobody's going to pay me what I make for myself.
Right.
Especially when you look at the amount of time I put in to make it right now, nobody is going to pay me that for any. No job would pay me that. Also, like when I did workshops, I did everything, right, from get the registrations to book the venues to make sure people show up, the whole shebang. And the offers I would get from other people saying, hey, how much would it cost for you to come over here and teach a course? None of those people would pay even close to what I made for myself. They would be shocked when I would say, here's how much it's going to cost. And a lot of times that would be lower than what I make on my own. And they'd be like, wow, that's pretty high. I was like, that's nothing. This is what I make on my own when I do everything. So I think if you're going to be an entrepreneur, you have to take 100% responsibility for your success. And that's a daunting task for a lot of people, just that statement alone. For me, it's exciting.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you have to manage all of that in such a way that you can be productive and don't do it at the consequence of your health, but do it in such a way that you can manage everything simultaneously.
Well, there's something to that as well. I mean, I almost died from pneumonia from the stress in the first year of my business, but at least half of that was personal life stress at the time, which frankly was paramount, way more so than the business stress. So I think that's another part also is that what's your personal life like? You have this very not hostile, but just very stressful personal life. That is going to take away a lot from what you can do professionally.
Absolutely. Well, let me share my final item here, and we can kind of wrap it up from there. Because I've got so much material, I'm just sort of trying to pick and choose here what might be helpful or beneficial. But let me end with this one last thing because it's so pervasive, and that is that it's almost like the debt item, which is dealing with your largest outflow or expense in life, which is your tax burden. And what I see in practice a lot is folks aren't necessarily being proactive when it comes to managing that tax burden. And so, I'll share a couple of items on this that I think would be helpful. But, the first is to be aware that there are 3 buckets, if you will, when it comes to taxes. And so there's a taxable bucket, there's a tax-free bucket, and there's a tax-deferred bucket. And knowing what the buckets are and knowing what opportunities you have available in terms of throughout your career, throughout your life, where your money should go, you've got to put some thought into the development of these buckets. So, for example, the taxable bucket, you generally, when you sell assets in a taxable bucket, you may pay taxes at a long-term capital gains rate. The tax-free bucket, that would be your Roth IRA, your Roth 401k. Those would be examples. Your tax-deferred bucket, this is the most common that people are familiar with, IRAs and SEP IRAs and simple IRAs, things like that. But what I don't see people doing is saying, okay, as a part of my strategy, what do I want to go and where? What do I want to put in each bucket, and how do I want to get them there? And we call that asset location. And so asset location is in part thing when I design a portfolio, I don't want to put tax inefficient assets in the wrong place. I don't want to put taxable assets in the wrong place. For example, REITs are inherently tax inefficient because they distribute most of their income as dividends. Right. And so it would be prudent to put that in a tax deferred or tax free bucket. Similarly, it would be imprudent to put municipal bonds, which throw out tax free income, in a tax free or tax deferred bucket. And so you've got to think about how you want to sort of structure your assets in these 3 buckets in terms of where you want them to go. Another thing I see with taxes is a lot of people justify poor financial decisions. I call it letting the tax tail wag the dog, and you don't want to let the tax tail wag the dog. Example would be you go out and you find a house you want to buy, and you're overpaying for it, but you justify it by saying that, hey, listen, I'm going to be able to write off the interest on this big mortgage on my taxes, And so you're making a poor economic decision by justifying it with a tax benefit, and in some instances, tax benefits should be at the forefront. But, if you haven't thought about this before, if you haven't put it in that perspective, then you won't really have a lot of guidance in terms of internally to figure out where you want to locate your assets, because a lot of this has to each their own, right? People have different opinions about where tax rates are going, where they'll be in retirement. And so, once you get clarity on where your opinions are with respect to choosing your own tax rate in the future, you can better determine, again, beginning with the end in mind, where you want to put your assets. And this is a critical decision because taxes are the largest detractor of wealth. And if you can manage your taxes properly throughout your lifetime, they can make huge differences. Huge differences on terminal wealth and ultimately the amount of money that you accumulate and build for yourself. So I think that's probably a good stopping point. I've got a bunch more stuff, but we obviously don't have time to go into it. So hopefully folks listening got some nuggets of insight. And I'll just share my website.
Yeah, absolutely.
Learn more. I've got a bunch of free resources and reports and white papers, if you will, for those who are actually interested in diving deeper into these topics and want to see some of the data and the specifics and some of the numbers and, some of the things that Mike asked about, how often and to what extent, to what percent do active investments outperform indexing and vice versa. You can find out all about those types of things in my free reports at the assetclassdifference.com. So if you go to www.theassetclassdifference.com, you can download those free resources. They're extremely helpful. And obviously, if anybody has any questions, you can always reach out to me one-on-one if you have any further questions.
And where can they reach you personally? Let's say if they want to discuss hiring you.
They can go to kalrafinancial.com. That's KALRA financial.com. And just click on free consultation, and you can schedule yourself right into my calendar.
All right. Sounds good, man. Well, hey, appreciate it. It's a ton of great information, very comprehensive, and we'll look forward to having you come back at some point.
Yep.
Thanks, guys. I really appreciate being on the show. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Rohit. Take care, man.
Take care. All right, bye.
All right, everyone, that's my good friend Rohit Kalra. Make sure you check out his information. And this is one of those episodes you're probably going to have to go back and listen to a few times.
Yeah,
take some notes.
Yeah, don't just listen to this one like directly in iTunes. Go ahead and download this one. Put it in a place that you will not lose it on your computer or on your phone or whatever, and go over this time and time again, because, again, we're in that time of the year where a lot of people really increase their debt. Okay, and these last couple of months right here. And we're about, when January 1st is right around the corner, which means it's tax season. It's about to get started. So all these things can help you be better prepared for that season coming up.
Yeah, and tis the year to increase your debt, and then also increase the surplus in stored body fat is another thing we see.
Yeah, because studies have shown that becoming a bigger fat ass is a direct correlation when your debt becomes fatter. So if you slim the debt, you slim the debt on your ass as well. So no, this is study. This is science. No, it's science, bro. It's science.
Well, I mean, think about it. You're expending, if you spend less money on garbage food, not only are you going to have more money in the bank, you're going to have less body fat on your body. So there you go. It's a 2-for-1 right there.
It's a win-win. I call that a great investment. Getting a solid return right there, man.
Now, one thing you can do to invest in yourself, that's another win-win situation, is you can use that coupon code LLA, get 10% off the best nutrition supplements around. My aggressive strength testosterone booster, which also has ashwagandha now, which is an incredible adrenal energy product. So check that out at mikemahler.com. Also, my estrogen blocker. A lot of you guys are in the season of bitch tits and gawks right now, and make 2016 the year that you turn back into a man, because right now you're halfway to having an organic sex change. Caitlin. So you can block that process by taking 3 caps of EC. Use that coupon code LLA, stock up, and make sure 2016 is a great year. And how about with you, man?
And you can also head over to newwarriortraining.com and use that same coupon code and invest in yourself by getting into my weight management 101 course. So again, investing in yourself by investing in a course that helps improve yourself. How about that? That's been a theme of the show so far. And
when you think about it, Sincere, they use your program, they're going to get healthier, they're going to have more energy, and that's going to make them more productive in whatever else they're trying to do.
Exactly. So that's a win-win right there. So look, folks, heading over to either one of those websites using that code, you're the winner here. You're the winner here. So we all win together like that. And also, you can also head over to patreon.com/LLA podcast and invest in this show, because you're already getting so much from it. Why not invest in it? Don't be a thief. Quit stealing. Okay,
yeah,
quit just taking information. Because you won't value the information if you're not investing in the information. If you're just taking free information, you're not going to do much with it. Most people don't do anything when you give it to them for free. You give it to them free, what they do is they just accumulate, they become hoarders. So stop being an episode hoarder and actually start taking action with the things that you hear on the show by investing in it. So once you put something in, you're definitely going to put it into action. So you can do that by heading over to Patreon, and there's a monthly investment right there that you make by supporting this show. All right.
All right, everyone. We'll see you next time.
All right. Take care, folks.